interview with Mr. Mike Ford and Robin Lee, and could you tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Hi, I'd like to say that I was born in Santa Rita in 1940. Technically, my parents came to town to pick me up at the Park Lane Hospital, but I pretty much have been a lifelong resident of Santa Rita. My family dates back to the first Spanish that arrived on the scene here in 1769. There was a member of the party with the surname Espinosa that I have traced back my family tree to, so we've been connected to the area since that time.
Robin Lee, and I moved in the area in 1995 and have lived in Santa Rita since moving to California. So I've been there since that time, and have heard a lot of good stories, and thankful for the opportunity at the library just to record some of the oral history of the Santa Rita community and the Santa Rita Creek as well.
Yes, you're working on the
Yeah, the Santa Rita watershed and the changes, and I'm very interested in how the growth of the community has impacted the creek and what changes it's gone through.
Well, Mr. Ford, would you like to tell us a little bit about your family when it came here?
Since we're focusing on the watershed and the creek, we should probably even go back before then and explain for anyone who might not realize it. The area between Santa Rita and Monterey Bay was pretty much totally wetlands originally, between the sloughs and the lakes and the creeks that ran down from the Gavilan Range trying to reach either the big Salinas River or before it flowed into the bay or go directly into the bay itself. So there was a very extensive amount of water, and that water was serving lots of good natural purposes. And so when the Native Americans came along, they found a pretty rich environment in which to survive living their way of life. The good things in the wetlands included the tules, which were used for very many things by the Native Americans, everything from the homes they built to some of the clothing that they wore and so forth. So they were living in the area and finding it quite a good way of life when the Spaniards did show up. The Spanish had only come along the coast in ships for a couple hundred years and hadn't come inland until this expedition came up in 1769, which was part military, part religious. It included Father Serra, who was coming up to start the first missions in California. Of course, the purpose of the missions was to change the way of life of the Native Americans that were here. They wanted to adopt them into the Spanish way of life, and it wasn't totally one-sided. The Native Americans here were interested in some of the different things about the Spanish way of life, and so there was some attraction to them coming into that way of life as well. There were some things that happened in the missions that didn't turn out the way they had planned originally, and there were lots of hardships that were brought to the people that were living here. Mainly the introduction of diseases that they weren't familiar with, and so there are some critics who don't appreciate what the Spanish did here, but there wasn't any harmful intent when they came. The military was supposed to build presidios to help protect the coast from other Europeans who might want to come and take California. And they were also connected with the mission work. The presidios had about 50 soldiers in them, so it's very different from the kind of military outposts that we're used to in more recent times, where there were larger groups of soldiers. They would further dilute their forces by having a small group of those soldiers go and live at the missions that were far away and couldn't be protected directly by the presidios. So very often a mission like the one down the valley there at Soledad would have probably 4 or 5 soldiers living there. And these guys would certainly not be in much of a position to be a major military force. What they served more than anything was like mailmen. They would ride back and forth between the mission and the presidio with messages that the priests had for the military folks, and back and forth. And so with one of them coming and one going, there's only about 3 of them left, and they lived very closely with the Native Americans there. They had their families that were living with them. And so it was more of a community right from the start than a us and them kind of thing that you might be more likely to picture. And they taught some things to the Native Americans, how to build with adobe and various other abilities that they brought with them. And of course they had the horse, which was an amazing change to the Native Americans who weren't familiar with that animal and the potential that it had. So there was a community that was started, and the mission records clearly show that there was intermarriage and family and community built up. As the missions were decreased in importance, the Spanish and then later the Mexican government issued grants of land to individual settlers, most of which were soldiers or their children. And they developed little communities on those ranchos that kind of began to substitute for what was no longer happening at the missions. The missions were secularized in the 1830s and were not supported as much after that as they had been earlier. So all those people who had been trained, all the Native Americans who were trained, were not able to continue living that form of life at the mission that they had been trained to live. So they quickly adopted to moving into the ranchos and becoming basically the first cowboys. They helped the rancheros herd these large herds of cattle, which had developed originally on the missions and were quickly switched over to a non-religious activity, which was a basic economic activity in the early days of the California.
They had cattle in the Salinas area, didn't they?
Oh, sure did, by the thousands. Each of these ranchos had large herds of cattle. That was their basic economic intent. The meat from the cattle wasn't so important as the hides and tallow. The tallow was very important in those days to make candles, which was a major source of light for people's homes. And of course there were lots of different uses for the cattle's hides. Made shoes and ropes and so forth. So the Native Americans fitted right into the new economy there and learned these different activities, and then the next great change came when the Americans took over California and the gold rush came swooping in on us by surprise and broke up a lot of those big ranchos. The new incoming folks didn't respect the property rights of the rancheros, and there was a lot of trouble over who was going to own what. And it took the Spanish Mexican landowners years and years, and sometimes never, to get their property rights respected. And by the time they got them, they had usually spent all of whatever value the land would have had on lawyers and so forth. So it was a very hard time for the Californio descendants, and of course right along with them the missionized Indians. So what we came up with in the mid-19th century was a situation where the person who had taken over the Santa Rita land grant, or the remains of it, was named Soto. He decided to try breaking up some of the remaining land into city lots and developing a community there that at various times was called Sotoville, New Republic, and eventually Santa Rita. And a lot of the people who ended up with these city lots and attempted to create a more urban community were the descendants of the Californios who had lived on the ranchos, and the Native Americans whose ancestors had come through the procedure of being missionized, and they all sort of developed a little community there in Santa Rita that was kind of a ghetto, separate from the newer white Anglo-Saxon Protestant types who had come across from the eastern states and eventually developed Salinas. So there was a bit of a conflict between the two communities there, cultural division.
This would be the 1800s and then
Yeah.
1850s.
Yeah, it was about 1850 that Soto started that, and it was about the 1870s when Salinas got roaring. Santa Rita was on a higher ground and better suited to developing a community than Salinas was. They were right down in the slough areas there of the wetlands. The wetlands, of course, had already begun to change. There was a lot of farming that was developing. There was a big push to grow wheat in the Salinas Valley early on, and so that changed a lot of the wetlands areas. I failed to mention that the earliest connection my family had was during the 1769 expedition, as they were wandering around looking for Monterey. They weren't quite sure they had found it. They also bumped into this lake where there was this Indian village, and it later became known as Espinosa Lake, so I suspect that the Espinosa who was on the expedition was pretty impressed with the area and was happy to have his grandchildren able to get the grants that they received in the area and end up with the family name attached to the lake, as well as the road that went past the lake. So we had a situation where Santa Rita was something of an old community before Salinas got started, and it was right on the edge of the wetlands and more into the higher ground where the oak woodlands and grasslands and so forth were of value, especially in the cattle raising days. There's still a nice stretch as you go north on Highway 101, just north of Santa Rita to the west side. It has still a nice, beautiful oak-covered hillside in there. That's the way the whole area used to be at one time. Across from it is the Shocks Dairy, which is the location of where my Espinosa ancestor first placed his adobe home. There is the Rancho grantee of Los Escarpinas, which is the one just north of Santa Rita. His brother Trinidad is the one who started the one in Santa Rita. As you're driving past Santa Rita on what I call the new highway, the freeway, you can see a grove of eucalyptus trees off to the west from Santa Rita. That's pretty much, we think, where Trinidad built his first home, where the creek runs right through there. So they were set up and trying to revamp their lives and live in the modern American way of life. still fighting for their property rights in the courts. That went on into the 1870s and 80s and even longer. And about that time, transportation being what it was in those days, the Southern Pacific Railroad was working very hard at getting a track run through. It was especially important if they were going to have a lot of agricultural commodities exported. Back in the good old days when they were working on cattle, they just dried the hides and tossed them into the next sailing ship that came by, and it was okay for them, but they really needed a railroad. So everybody decided they wanted the railroad to go through their town so that it would be good to develop their economy. And if all was fair, Santa Rita probably would have been on the top of the list to choose where the railroad went, but the guys in Salinas pulled a few political strings, and even though their ground wasn't as good to build the railroad on, they got the railroad, and that's how Salinas became a big city, and Santa Rita sort of drifted into the forgotten northern section of town that it is today. So through all this time period, the creek did run through Santa Rita, and there were some connections with the creek all through our lives there. We just called it the creek. There was only one. We had one store and one plaza and one church and one school. We didn't have to give them any more of a name than the church, the school, the store. Everybody knew what we were talking about. So it was the creek. It wasn't until the freeway went through and the state of California built a bridge over the creek to get the freeway running and put up a nice little sign on the highway there, that I even knew that it was called Little Bear Creek. So that's the official name of Santa Rita Creek, is Little Bear Creek. I suppose I should have known that sooner, but that's how I found that one out. And it certainly had changed a lot over the years. And then from the time that the freeway went in, it again began to change. I think it was in the late 50s.
Late 50s?
Same time that it went through Car Flats here in the middle of Salinas. Before that, the highway was what is now North Main Street, so the Santa Rita community was actually divided by the highway. That was an experience in and of itself. If you're coming from town trying to make a left turn to go to our house on the west side of Santa Rita, you had a heck of a time. You were slowing down in the fast lane, and the guys behind you were trying to get to San Jose or whatever on the highway, and they didn't want you to slow down in front of them. And of course, the guys coming into town in the southbound lane weren't too willing to slow down, and wasn't anything resembling a stoplight. So we had some hairy times just getting home from town, and we did call it town. Salinas was town. It was 2 miles away. We went there to go to the movies or shop for groceries if we didn't want to pay the high prices at our little store. But it did divide the community. We were fortunate on the west side to have the store. Moss's ran the store for decades there. And the church up the hill from us, of course, was another major part of the community. It was a Catholic church. It was just the church to us. All of the residents were more or less Catholic, depending on your definition. And some of us went to church part of the time. I was altar boy there for a number of years. The east side had the advantage of having the school. That was the big thing on the east side of town. And of course, we had to get to school, so getting across the highway was a problem if you didn't want to wait for the school bus to stop at the store and pick you up before it tried to turn across the highway. There was one secret way that we could get back and forth without having to risk our lives crossing the highway. There was a bridge over the creek. Right where the Capitol Motel is today, in North Main Street, you can still see the bridge. And us kids would climb under the bridge and go along the creek to get back and forth from the west side to the east side. And so that was doable then. In later years, when they started concreting and fencing and some of the things that we'll hear about from more specifics about the creek, why, of course, we lost access to even that much of the creek activities.
Was it a tight community? Were you all?
Pretty much, because like I said, they were all descendants of the earlier communities. It's kind of like reading a list of the California history to go down to the surnames of the neighbors. We had Sobraneses and Gutierrezes and Alvarados, and the whole list. Ford was kind of a weird one, but my grandmother was an Espinosa, so I was okay. My grandmother made the mistake of marrying a crazy cowboy from San Francisco who shouldn't even have been named Ford, but that's another story. So,
was there any, did people farm out there at all? Have dairies?
Oh, yeah, there was still a lot of dairying, and the farming was more dryland farming, beans, hay. Many, if not most, of the people living in the community of Santa Rita would work on these ranches. They were small family farms, but they still hired a couple of workers to help them out. And that was kind of tough because it would get kind of slow during the winter and a lot of people would be out of work. So there was, we said there was only one of most of everything. One thing there was more than one of was bars, I'm sorry to say, and of course a lot of free time would be spent in one or another of Santa Rita's infamous bars back in the... I'm moving into my... I was telling the story of the previous times in the community, but I've kind of moved into my own time period. As I said, I was basically born in Santa Rita in 1940, but family moved around some until during World War II, when my father was in the Army in Japan. My mother and I did live in a rental that was just a block down from the house that they had been renting when I was born. And of course our lifelong neighbors, the Wilcoxes, were just across the street. And we had already owned the lots that became my parents' home in 1948, but there wasn't any building on them yet. So my mother and I were living in this rental, Mrs. Fernandez. And then after the war, we moved over to Castroville for a while. My father was working for what was called the Salinas celery distributors at the time, and then they went bust, and so he was out of work. And luckily, we had just put up a little cabin on their property, and that ended up being our home just overnight. I'll either have to outshot the fire guys or shut up for a minute, huh? Yeah, let me sip. How are we doing time-wise here? Okay. So, basically what happened was that from 1948 on, my parents were permanent residents of Santa Rita, living across the street from where they had been living when I was born in 1940, on lots that they had purchased for $200. They started with this little cabin that my father and his neighbor Luther Wilcox basically built. Knotty pine interior was kind of neat. I always remember that, but it was little. And so it was a big deal for the family in the 60s when they put up the house that I'm living in today, a stucco building. A contractor put it up for $7,000. And my parents had to pay a big monthly installment of about $50 for 20-some years to pay off their loan. They thought it was really tough going, you know. And in more recent days, we've put up another building in front of the old house, which is just a shed now. And so we've filled in our lots there with places to live, and it's a little different than the normal million-dollar home that you can't afford, that people have to buy because there isn't anything else to buy. So we were lucky to get what we got when we got it. And my parents were just, that was it for them. They lived there until their deaths. I meandered around the planet back and forth, always keeping in touch, so I always considered myself to be a member of the Santa Rita community. And
Well, what was it like growing up there when you were young? I mean,
well, the creek did have a large part to do with it. We spent a lot of time basically playing in the creek. That's what we called it. That's what we were doing. It could be anything from catching tadpoles to throwing dirt clods at one another to what have you. Back in the early days of my childhood, the creek was still free-flowing, and there were times during the year when there wasn't any water to speak of coming down the creek. And then there were times when there was some pretty roaring near flood situations. Mid-1950s, there was quite a rough winter where the water was getting up kind of high, and we were keeping an eye on it, but it never flooded anything. So it was still handling, even though it had been abused and misused even by that point in time, it was still handling the basic chore of moving water through that it was supposed to.
do they have fish?
Certainly had frogs. I don't think the water levels were steady enough. There's certainly plenty of fish in Espinosa Lakes at the time still, and maybe farther upstream there was still fish, but running through Santa Rita there wouldn't have been any fish. Actually, yeah. Us kids probably did some hunting we shouldn't have done. We had BB guns, of course, always shooting the poor birds, but young teens, we even took our shotguns around and blasted whatever might fly by foolishly. And that was probably illegal, if not silly, to do. But you know, there was a little dove hunting and quail hunting and stuff still. The adults, of course, not right there, but they would go off hunting deer and stuff during deer season, and that was still a common part of life to hunt and fish. South County was pretty good deer hunting country back then, and a lot of them had family connections, or they knew somebody who would let them get onto their. There's a lot more cattle ranching continuing on in South County into the 20th century than there was up here. We had a lot of plant life along the creek back then. There were some willow groves and a lot of plants that needed water that wouldn't have been growing without the water. And then things as you got farther away from the creek, everything from mustard plants to what have you, watercress and stuff, some of it native and some of it just introduced. And besides playing in the creek also formed an obstacle if you wanted to go to what was on the other side depending on how wet you wanted to get. So we made various efforts to bridge the creek, whether it just be a plank slapped across where the water was running or whatever. And of course, none of those things lasted particularly long, but they served their purpose. I had the major task of crossing the creek more routinely because my grandfather, who had my grandfather on my mother's side of the family, which that side of the family also had similar California history connections. A lot of the ancestors of the Weeks side of the family came on the Anza expedition to 1776, where several hundred people came up through central Mexico and across Arizona into California. That was the major colonizing effort, really, of the Spanish period. Several of the families coming on that were connected with my mother's side of the family. They settled more in the Santa Clara County area, San Jose and so forth. But my grandfather moved down to Santa Rita probably in the 1930s, maybe earlier. So he was living there, and he had a place on the other side of the creek, so in order to visit Grandpa, I had to get across the creek. And sometimes I would even sleep at his house and stuff, so I got to be quite a commuter, crossing the creek back and forth and having numerous nighttime adventures, being sure that the boogeyman was behind the willow trees and things. But all of that sort of stuff changed after the freeway went in and they began to treat the creek very differently. When they concreted it, that was kind of the bitter end. I still managed to take the dog walking even after the concreting occurred, like in the 1970s. And there was still an effort being made by the natural powers that be. Plants would continue to try to grow in spite of the concreting, and birds and insects and so forth would still be.
Just putting concrete on the road bed?
No, they actually, like the Los Angeles River, concreted the riverbed.
Oh,
So that the water would flow more freely, and whatever their thinking was. And about the only benefit kids got out of it was the guys with skateboards used to like to go romp around in the concreted corners. But I took my dog for many walks there in the 70s, and there were still things like snipe and killdeer hanging around in the creek area there, and still some plants trying to struggle and continue to grow. Then when they worked on the water system and got the big water well drilled to help the city water situation and put in that humongous tank that they've got there now, then of course they fenced and blocked, and we can't even reach the creek literally anymore from the west side of Santa Rita. It's totally separate from us. We can look at it on Main Street, and down at our street is Brutus Street. It dead ends into the creek, so we can still go down to the end of the street and look through the fence at the concreted creek. This is all on the west side I'm talking about now. There's still sections on the east side over by the school where that sort of thing hasn't been done yet. Hopefully it won't be. I can remember when we'd go out to recess at school, we had this big grove of trees that ran from the school building down to the creek, and kids would sneak off and go play in the creek during recess sometimes even. But things are much more restricted today, and there's much less life in the creek than there was during my childhood. Kids have to stay home and watch video games now instead of playing in the creek, I guess. We used to have quite a time. There's some advantages to living in a neighborhood where you have a dead-end street. We'd play in the street and it was relatively safe. Nobody was going to run over us. We'd play ball and kick the can at night and stuff. And the neat thing about our ball field was that the creek served as the wall. You know, if you hit the ball over the creek, you'd hit a home run. So it was kind of fun.
That's an important part.
So I don't know, we could ramble on about more details, but maybe we should cut it off at this point and give...
What area of Santa Rita did the Santa Rita Indians live in?
Well, we're basically...
They spread through, or is there...
We're all Indians. The school actually used that logo, Santa Rita Indians, for their sports team, but literally, practically everyone living in town had Indian ancestry. My Espinosa ancestors came as mestizos. They already had Indian in them when they got here. Some of them married into local Native American groups after they got here, but my direct line doesn't show any connection to the California Indians. But my lifelong neighbors, the Wilcoxes, they had Indian, California Indian blood in them. The Sobraneses down next to them certainly did, and the Sylvies, practically every, the Alvarados, every family in town other than us had California Indian blood in them.
Do you know any area, people that were native to this area?
Well, like I said, it went mainly back to the setting up of the community by Soto, and those folks came in from wherever they could, some of them down the valley, Soledad area and stuff. The Native Americans who were actually living at what became known as Espinosa Lake in 1769, when the Spanish first arrived, I don't think we could tie in anything directly with them. It would sort of depend on which mission they went to, if they went to a mission, and track them from there. The records are very good. It's one of the things the Spanish did, the Franciscans and the missions. They did very good record keeping in terms of who married who and who was born when and who died when. And so that sort of historic detective work can be done. I don't know that I could sit here today and say that particular family in Santa Rita had ancestors who had always lived in the Santa Rita area. That'd be pretty hard to do. It might be possible to prove that. The Wilcox connection to Native American seems to have come out of Soledad area, but my lifelong neighbor Laverne is still working on the details of that. She's more into genealogy work than I am. She's off visiting her sister in Arizona, or she'd have probably had her arm twisted to come down and talk with you today. She and I are about the same age, and our families have been neighbors all that time, so we're pretty close.
How far up the creek did you travel as kids? Did you go up into the Bolson Falls area at all, or?
We never went that direction too much, not following along the creek. Maybe some of the kids on the east side hung out more over there. We went more to the west. I think I've told you about the, I think I mentioned earlier, the grove of eucalyptus trees west of Santa Rita. We call that area the Lane. And there was actually, before the freeway went through, there was a road or a street that went down there. And we'd go down there, and the creek ran right through that. And sometimes we'd follow the creek down from our houses to the lane. That was an especially good teenage hangout. It was far enough away from home that you couldn't hear if anybody was calling you, and you weren't so far away that you get into too much trouble when you did get home. So that was more the extent of our travels. That picture that we have showing the kids in the creek in the 20s, that was one of the Salinas family was in that picture. And that was taken along that stretch there between the big curve where there used to be Willow Grove and the lane. Pretty good flow in the river at that point. It was in the early 20s. I don't know what time of year it was taken, but certainly don't get that kind of water running through much anymore.
Did you notice a change in the population of the frogs and tadpoles over the years?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there used to be very large numbers back in the late 40s, early 50s. And it pretty much crashed in the late 50s and 60s. Yeah, we used to catch the tadpoles and stick them in jars and watch them grow legs, and then we'd throw them back in the creek. Hope we didn't do too much damage to the population while we were having our little innocent science lessons there. But yeah, there was just a humongous number of them back in the 40s. As the water was flowing relatively freely there, there were dry seasons, but at that point the frogs were probably all fully developed and didn't need any water for the tadpoles, and they could get by in the little puddles that were left. But no, that's pretty much all gone now.
Well, at this point, we can either, come back another time. I have more questions to ask you, but you might be getting a little...
Well, I probably should dig around and see what we can do.
Where it was a little higher and be less
Politics.
We know why. We know why.
Very definitely politics.
But the building will be easier. But Salinas is built on sloughs, and I know there's people tell me that there's redwood piping all through the town, and one of these days they're just going to collapse, and they're going to find out where the slough is running underground, because it's still here, it's just underground now.
Oh, yeah.
So they use redwood then, and it's still in the ground. So one of these days it's just going to
last a long time, but not forever, huh?
Yeah. So they would run the creek through the redwood piping and then build on top of it.
Where's it come out?
There's remnants of Alisal Slough down at the intersection of Davis and Blanco, Davis and Blanco, and it kind of comes out down that way.
Really? Oh.
And also the stormwater runs off, that's all piped now, and that runs to, in this area, I think I don't know where the divide, but the southwest end of Salinas runs into Salinas River. There's a pumping station down by the animal shelter on Hitchcock. So all that's been artificially piped underground, and now it drains that way. So the remnant of the slough is down at that intersection. And then the current underground drainage system that was artificially put in when they built the different blocks in the city goes that way. But right along Hartnell, the divide, it goes into the waterway they dug to drain all the lakes.
So the ravine is that goes across Alisal? There's a ravine. Is that
That's remnant of the slough.
Which do you know the name of it?
That's the Alisal Slough.
That's Alisal.
They call it the reclamation ditch, but we're also calling it Lower Gabalon and Alisal Creek. The upper part is Alisal Creek, which runs into Carr Lake, and the part that leaves Carr Lake, we're calling Lower Gabalon Creek, and that goes to Castroville.
There's a ravine that runs right
That's
off that big White House.
That's remnant of Alisal Slough.
Huh.
There's bits of it all around the city that hasn't been filled in.
Well, there's a big section that crosses North Main heading for Car Flat there, it's still open.
Yeah. Yeah, that was those waterways were built in the 1917.
They used to have the brewery hanging around in that
They dug them out.
section. The old brick
On
building.
North Main.
Yeah, big brick building.
Was it the Minky?
Brewery.
Was it Minky?
I don't know what they called it.
But when they kind of channelized the Alisal Creek and put in that concreted the whole creek and then fenced it, and it became a barrier. And so a lot of people that in Mike's time that were born, raised, and played in the creek, they will not let their kids play in the creek because they deem it polluted. And it is. It's highly polluted.
Well, it wasn't pure back in my day anyway.
No.
We didn't know as much about what might be good or bad as we do today. The one time that we got a little bit leery about it was in the 50s when they were having all the scare about polio, that
Yeah.
they thought maybe it wouldn't be a good idea to play in the creek so much. But that was the only time.
Yeah, you have
anybody
septic
ever-
systems there, so a lot of those septic systems were built in the 50s and 60s. They're still there.
Yeah, that was one of the
So it's
problems in Santa Rita. A lot of the people were using the creek basically as an outlet for their systems, and so that didn't purify the water a whole lot either.
yeah. It's I know in the Bolsonols, this area above where Mike ranged from, Bolsonols is north across Russell Road, and that's a whole nother community. Has its own history, but they're still on septic, and they're still draining. It's not the land doesn't perk real well, and so it flows horizontally. I'm sure it outfalls into the creek eventually. Not very well treated. The transit time's probably quite short.
I guess they got started in the 1930s up in there. 30s, 40s. It was pretty, Bolsono's was pretty developed by the 50s.
So it's been impacted by various ways, but once the channelization started and the ag went from grazing to row crop, and the runoff characteristics changed, there was more runoff carrying more sediment, and that's very detrimental to the amphibian population in the creek. So from that time, and it's the more strawberry fields and more row crops they're putting in, they're still doing that. The higher the runoff, the greater the impact downstream from those crop areas. So it's still ongoing. Even in my time, from moving into 1995 till now, there's been a decrease in frog population. There was some when I moved in. You could hear them in February when the rainy season had been around, and they had laid their eggs, and you could hear them. But now you don't.
Strawberry picking was a good job, though. Us kids did a lot of
Did you do strawberry picking?
strawberry picking in our school days. Yeah, you could eat as many as you picked.
I know someone in the 70s went out and picked strawberries
Yeah.
as a kid.
Yeah, we were still connected with that in my childhood. Nowadays, you have to be a member of the union and the whole bit with the commercialization that's gone on. But it used to be, you could just, hey, you need anybody to help pick your strawberries? Yeah, come on, and here, grab a basket and start picking, kind of thing. We made a few dollars to spend, you know, but we certainly wouldn't have been able to survive on it as a real job. That's the difference nowadays. The pickers have to do it to make a living.
Boy, they're fast too. There's no way to be able to keep up. They don't really know what they're doing. Just to go do it part-time wouldn't make a lot of money compared to what the people who do it full-time. So,
That's another disconnect with the community, though.
yeah. Yeah, I hear stories of people, they grew up, they went, as you said, when they were summertime, they would work in the fields, and then they go back to school.
Right.
And you don't get that now so much.
Yeah, I know. My dad did too. He worked in the canning things, not around here.
Yeah.
It's just something that he did.
Well, the packing sheds was the big thing around here.
Right.
My mother worked in a carrot shed for many, many years.
Oh, did she? They had carrots? I didn't know they had carrots around here.
Carrots and celery were the two big items in the packing sheds.
Well, I certainly do thank you for coming in today. I really appreciate
Well,
it.
considering it's supposed to be her turn, I think I did all the talking. Now we're in trouble, huh?
No, we're good.
Oh, no, no.
We're very good.
We have Robin Lee for a long, long time. She put in her comments at the end, but I do hope you'll come back.
Yeah, you might want to kind of clue me in on what some of the things are that you're trying to delve into, and give me a chance to
Sure.
do a little advanced research next time instead of just talking off the top of my head.
Well,
The high school was a 3-year high school back then, and we had the option of coming into Washington sooner, but I stuck it out in the 8th grade in Santa Rita and came in for the 9th grade. Yeah, a lot of school bus riding.
So we're the current elementary school, that's been a school site.
Yeah, the buildings have changed, but it's the
Same site.
same plot of ground.
Yeah.
not to Washington.
Washington Junior High?
What was that?
You didn't go to Salinas High, didn't you?
Yeah, I went to Washington Junior High for 9th grade and then Salinas High for the other 3
Where's
years.
Washington?
Oh, it's just
It's
down
Clay Street, is
there. It's
it?
still down there.
Oh, okay.
Washington's over there. I'm not good at directions and routes.
Yeah, they're cutting down to 8th grade now, but they're still going.
Well, we will get some, I will tell you some of the things that I'm interested in. You've already covered some of the things I was really wondering about. And are you involved with I know Mona Gudgel at the Monterey County Historical Society said someone was working on history for Santa Rita.
Yeah, the main thing we've worked on recently has been the church. We've got the church remodeled and up to snuff, and we're trying to talk the diocese into going back to having at least occasional services there. But the main part of the project was the cemetery.
Yeah, I've got
And
Anna, do you know
Laverne.
Anna Elkington?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Laverne did a lot of the research on that, who was buried there, and they did a fundraiser and got a nice big block there with all the names that they discovered of people that are buried there but don't have individual recognition in terms of their gravestones. My grandfather, I mentioned my grandfather. My grandfather's buried there. We have a little stone thing for him and his brother. 2 of the Weeks boys are buried there. 1960s period. And so that was the major effort that we've put out recently, has been the church.
Yeah, Anne's brought things in to me. It's pretty impressive.
So most everything else is gone now. There's a couple of older buildings still left.
That saddlery, was that?
A crude saddlery went in the late 40s, early 50s.
That's at the corner of Boulevard and Main Street.
Yeah, they were out-of-town folks who settled in there and joined the community. They're Native Americans too, the southwestern type tribes. The old man there.
It was recently sold, and now it's
Yeah.
some offices.
Yeah, he was deaf. And he did the actual saddle making, and his wife and his mother-in-law did most of the fancy artwork on the saddles. And I knew his kids pretty well.
Are they still around?
Their mother just died, and they came down and had a ceremony and stuff, but I think one of the daughters lives up north of San Francisco now, and I'm not sure where the other ones are. But they were an interesting addition to the community. The only thing that was on that whole lot there during the earlier childhood, before they showed up, was Moss's store. And of course, Moss's had taken it over from the previous owners. It had a long history of being Santa Rita's store there.
That building's not there anymore.
Soto had actually started it. No, the building burned. The 7-Eleven or whatever that thing is on the corner now is in the same location.
Oh, is that where it was?
Yeah, but the rest of the area was vacant, and we turned it into a ball field. We had some mighty good softball games in that lot. As long as you didn't hit too far into right field and get into trouble with the cruises, so you were okay. Left field was more room to hit the ball. So we had some great ball games. It's amazing how we played totally unsupervised. No great amount of coaching or whatever, and we didn't seem to have too many fights about it. We just played our ball games, and it was fun, and that was how it went. Now Little League and whatnot, they have to have uniforms and rules and all the rest of it. And they fight more than we did.
Well, there isn't a lot of free space around.
That's the trouble. Kids don't have the room to do their stuff anymore.
Yeah, I was brought up the same way. We roamed, and we had the woods and the creek, and we played our games and
It
our
has to be
sports.
fed to them nowadays. They
That's
can't get it on their own.
We got out games from the neighborhood. Stuff like that. Don't do that too much.
Yeah, we had some wild nighttime kick the can games. Yeah, a lot of places to hide.
Yeah, it sounds like it was. It always sounds so ideal. I've been reading.
Well, we were poor, but we didn't know any better.
Yeah, same here. We're quite poor as well.
Our stomachs were full,
Right.
and we had enough clothes on to get by, so it worked out okay.
Wow.
Okay, so next.
Craig, I think it was, one of the older Alvarados at that time, came over for my first adult sheep, a ewe that I was going to raise lambs from, needed to be sheared. And the way that was being done at that time was they had the electric clippers, and Greg Alvarado came over with an old-fashioned pair of sheep shears and sheared that sheep for us. It was just an amazing thing to see. I used them to block my animals out for the fair, you know, cut a little hair off here and there to make them look blockier, but he actually shaved this sheep's wool off by hand.
Go to.
Monterey, King City, Watsonville, yeah, we made the full rounds. I was in Future Farmers in high school. And we had a 4-H club out at Natividad that I belonged to for the duration there. With a lot of the farm kids in the area. They all came in and went to Santa Rita School too. So yeah, the Alvarados have a great history there, and they're very much into the Indian part of the story too. So those sisters would be good, and they might get some of their other family members involved too.